3, 2, 1.
Hi, good evening. Welcome to the February community meeting of the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis. Welcome all. We hope that, we hope that you had a great Black History Month, and we welcome you to this last day of Black History Month. We are very pleased that you decided to join us and spend your time with us at this very present time. My name is Rich Watkins. Some of you know me. I was not able to make it last month. The pandemic found my household. And so it was quite a struggle to keep all the balls in the air at that time. And I just was not able to make it. And I very much missed all of you. But before I go any further and welcome our guest, tell you a little bit about myself and one of our strategic priorities of the LSP for this year. Let's begin, as we always do, with a moment of silence. We'll give it 3 minutes. And what has been in the news lately, unfortunately, is the incursion over in Europe of Ukraine. And many people are displaced because of this. People already lost their lives, and something to think about. And you may want to spend a little time sharing a thought about those over there and asking for strength to be given to our leaders during this time. So I will start our 3 minutes now. All right, thank you very much. Hello again. My name is Rich Watkins, and I am the new board president I know some of you, and I look forward to meeting all of you in the near future. A little about me. I am a native Memphian. I was educated at Morehouse in the 90s before getting my law degree from Georgetown in 2000. I also lived in Philadelphia and Chicago before moving me and my family back home in 2014. I first became involved with LSP in January of 2018 after visiting EJI and the Lynching Site Memorial in Montgomery. I was, like so many others who had visited the site, I was moved by what I saw and experienced, and I wanted to be a part of this movement in Memphis. So I hunted down LSP, and they welcomed me with open arms. I was honored to be elected to serve as board president this past December. So I have to say, I look forward to seeing everyone again. I remember our in-person meetings at First Baptist for a while, and then in Ottawa. And we will be exploring ways to meet again in person later on this year. One of our priorities for this year is the L. Persons lynching site development. As many of you know, L. Persons' murder was witnessed by thousands of people on May 22nd, 1917, after being promoted by the local newspaper. It was the definition and remains the definition of a spectacle lynching. The lynching was a significant and influential event of national importance. LSP has been working with Representative Steve Cohen to get the site included into the National Park Service. Over the past several weeks, we have spoken with Representative Cohen's office a number of times and have helped him write a letter to President Biden calling for the site to enter the National Park Service under the Antiquities Act. If this happens, we believe it will be the first lynching site to be admitted into the National Park Service. Getting this done will be another step forward in healing our community and indeed our whole nation. For the remainder of this year, we are planning to increase awareness of the L. Persons lynching on a local, regional, and national level. Please be on the lookout for events, and we look forward to having your support throughout the year. Now, I would like to introduce for you all our speaker for this evening, Attorney Phyllis Aluko. In 2015, she led our community's effort to commemorate the victims of the 1866 Memphis Massacre with a historical marker. Working with the support of the Memphis Branch of the NAACP and the National Park Service, she became part of a collective effort to increase the public's awareness of this tragic event that many believe finally spurred Congress to refer the hotly debated 14th Amendment to the states for ratification. The wording and title of the proposed historical marker prompted significant discussion in the Tennessee Historical Commission, leading to serious uncertainty as to whether the historical marker would be erected in time to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the massacre. But we persisted, she persisted, and the historical marker is entitled 1866 Memphis Massacre. It was unveiled on the sesquicentennial of the massacre in Army Park on the corner of GE, Patterson, and Second Street. The marker was ultimately erected without the support of the Tennessee Historical Commission, but with the support of a diverse, collaborative, and large group of Shelby Countians. Jessica, for questions, Phyllis is going to do her presentation, and we will open it up for Q&A afterward. But Jessica, are we capable, or is the community capable of submitting questions during the talk that we could then read later? You're on mute, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a Q&A box. So if anybody has questions that arise, they can type them in the box, and then we'll make sure that at the end of Phyllis's presentation that we address those.
All right. Awesome. So as you listen, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and we will be sure to ask it when Attorney Aluko is done with the presentation. So without further ado, Attorney Phyllis Aluko, take it away.
Thank you, Rich, so much. And thank you to the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis for inviting me to speak with you today. I must admit that I'm always approached these speeches with a little trepidation, because especially with a group like the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis, because I know that you all are full of historians and I am not a historian, but I will give this a try anyway. What is, if we could go to the first slide, please, Jessica. So what is the 1866 Memphis Massacre? The Memphis Massacre was a 3-day attack from May 1st through 3rd of 1866. The next slide, please. Sorry, yes. It was an attack on Black people in Memphis that led to many people being murdered, Black women being raped, numerous robberies and assaults of Black people, and every Black schoolhouse and every Black church in Memphis being destroyed. The attack on the Black community was perpetrated by a mob of white people who were led by law enforcement. The attack occurred just 1 year following the end of the Civil War and 1 day following the mustering out of service of a regiment of Black Union soldiers that were stationed at Fort Pickering in South Memphis. News of the massacre went viral and sparked outrage nationwide in 1866. Congress convened a select committee to investigate the massacre. The select committee members traveled to Memphis in late May 1866, and they interviewed more than 100 witnesses and transcribed the testimony. Many copies of the committee's report were printed and distributed to the public nationwide. Now, many believe that it was the outrage following the Memphis Massacre that finally convinced Congress to approve the hotly debated text of the 14th Amendment to our Constitution. And after that text was approved by Congress, it was then referred to the states for ratification. Of course, we all know that it took another 2 years for enough states to ratify the amendment, but had Congress not finally closed debate and approved the text, we would not have the 14th Amendment, it's likely today. We all know how important the 14th Amendment is to our nation. It's the amendment that enshrines citizenship by birth, equal protection and due process of law into our Constitution in a manner that would be applicable to all of the states. We could go to the next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about the pathway to the historical marker. I was certainly not the obvious person to lead an effort to erect a historical marker. As I said before, I'm not a historian. I didn't even know the story of the 1866 Memphis Massacre until 2015. Instead, I was an overworked advocate with little time to read anything other than appellate transcripts, statutes, and case law. Yet Professor Stephen Ash's book, A Massacre in Memphis, kept appearing as suggested reading for me on my e-reader. I ignored it for some time because I didn't realize it was a historical book. I thought it was a fictional or horror book or some other genre that I had no interest in reading. I finally actually read the description of the book and realized that it was a narrative of a real life event that had occurred in my hometown of Memphis, and I was immediately intrigued. Although I'm not a historian, I am someone who has come to appreciate the vital impact of history in every aspect of our lives. As I recall, it was probably history that led me to discover my love of advocacy. I attended elementary school through 8th grade in Mississippi, where my mother taught school. I believe the first real history course that my school offered was in the 7th grade. And that class also happened to be what I understand was our junior high school's first experiment with hosting an advanced study class. It was called Spotlight, a class for gifted students. And I'm sad to say that although I knew there were probably many more gifted kids in the 7th grade at my school, my gifted class was a small class of about 5 students, all white, except for one glaring exception. It was the only such class at the school, and I now think it is particularly telling that the predominantly white school chose American history an often subjective and highly politicized area of study, for their first venture into providing an advanced curriculum for its gifted students. It was that highly subjective, politicized view of history that brought about my first public act of advocacy that I now call my 7th grade protest. As the only Black student in my advanced class, I found the way in which history was being taught by our very popular teacher to be problematic. It seemed that my advanced history class took an entire, extremely big book filled with lots of historical information and condensed it to instruction about the Civil War era. Anyway, that was my perspective. It felt like we spent almost the entire year being taught the Southern perspective of the Civil War. And frankly, that is the only academic information that I believe I retained from the class. We learned that slavery was not the horrible, peculiar institution that Northern carpetbaggers portrayed it to be, that many slaves, including those owned by my teacher's ancestors, were so happy with being treated in a condescendingly inhumane manner that they voluntarily chose to remain with their masters out of loyalty following the fall of slavery. And we learned that the rebel flag was a symbol of national pride and states' rights, and very ironically, individual freedom. Such instruction inevitably involved or maybe devolved into a discussion of current political and social topics that ultimately used the revisionist narrative of the historical facts that we were being taught as justification for whatever political view my teacher was espousing. Interestingly, leadership didn't seem to be concerned at the time with how the distorted teaching of history would affect students of color who were hearing their historical truths remain unacknowledged or improperly maligned. The contortion of the historical Civil War facts in an effort to inculcate students with a distorted narrative really angered me. It angered me to the point of compelling me to act. I was both outraged and disillusioned at the chasm between the actual events of the past as experienced by my community and what we were being taught in history class. You see, although I'd been reluctantly told that I was gifted by the school system, I was still not smart enough to recognize that the very name of the subject that I was being taught foretold the type of instruction that I was receiving. Think about it, his story. Not her story, not their stories, but his story. And in that advanced history class in the 7th grade, I came to learn that his meant white male, and story meant the narratives that were told to support the prevailing power structure in the local community. So it is with that prior experience that on a whim, I purchased and read A Massacre in Memphis and was stunned. I was so stunned that I felt that I needed to read the transcribed testimony of the witnesses myself. So I ordered a copy of the Congressional Select Committee's report. That report allowed me to hear the unfiltered perspective of law enforcement, as well as the stories of Black people like Mr. Jackson Goddell, Ms. Rachel Hatcher, and so many others who were victimized during the massacre. Next slide, please. You know, I thought this was particularly telling, the statement of the Shelby County Sheriff at the time, Sheriff Winters. And in this particular slide that is showing now, it's not telling one of the most horrible events that occurred, but it's particularly telling as to the situation that our forefathers and foremothers had to bear at the time. So if you notice the highlighted section, this is Sheriff Winters talking. He says, "There is another matter I forgot to state. On the first night of the riot, on the corner of Adams and Main Streets, I believe it was, it appeared there was a lot of boys calling themselves the Mackerel Brigade, got after a Negro. I happened to be going up the sidewalk and saw them. These boys were a set of little thieves. I crossed over took the Negro and gave him to a man by the name of Jim Coons and sent him to the station house for protection. He was taken there and turned out in the morning. He was not injured, although he would have been, but for my interference. And then Sheriff Winters is asked, what was the age of these boys? From 8 to 12 or 13 years of age. Of what nativity? Pretty much all born in this country. Of what parentage? Almost every description. They are a very bad set of boys, some with Jewish parents, some with Irish, and so on. I arrested 6 of them when I was chief of police for robbing a bank of $500 or $600. Now, why did I pick this passage as being particularly telling? No one died in this passage, although many people were murdered during the massacre. But this really explains the social structure in a way that I don't think could be better, could be done in any better way. If you think about it, the sheriff of Shelby County comes upon a group of boys age 8 to 13 who are attacking what is presumably a Black man. The sheriff's remedy for the situation is to take the Black man and put the Black man in jail, and then he's bragging to the select committee that he probably saved the Black man's life. This shows the difference in how the criminal justice system, even back in 1866, treated Black people from white people. The sheriff of the county felt like the only recourse, the only appropriate manner of responding to seeing a group of boys whom he's arrested before for robbing a bank of $500 or $600 and whom he believes are known as thieves is to arrest the Black person. Let them go the next day. But there's no community effort to correct the behavior of the boys. No lessons were learned there. And these are children age 8 to 12 or 13, children who have been arrested before, but when they're attacking a Black man in Memphis in 1866, nothing is done to them. Instead, the Black man is arrested and then later released. So that is why I thought that was particularly telling. I can tell you that reading these stories, reading the story of Jackson Goddell, who was murdered on, I believe it was the first night, it was the first or the second night of the massacre. He was murdered, taken to the police station where his wife later went to try to find him, and she was initially refused access. By the time she was granted access, he had died in custody. Miss Rachel Hatcher, particularly poignant story. She went next door to help her neighbor whose house had been set on fire during the massacre. And she was shot and killed and died in between the houses. And she was just a teenager, described as a brilliant student. So there are many stories like that that I read. And basically I read their stories and my heart cried. I cried because of the inhumane injustice that they'd experienced during slavery. I cried because of the hope just born that was crushed before it could grow mature. I cried because no one was ever held accountable for the obvious injustices that they endured. I cried because I knew what injustice they and their progeny were yet to endure. I cried because I, like so many in our community, had forgotten their stories. I cried because I had never known this story. I cried because although we'd never met, I knew them with an intimacy that was timeless. I cried with pride because of their courage and will to survive and thrive. And then I became resolved. Although I learned about many atrocities that had occurred, the thing that stunned me the most was the fact that I'd learned about this massacre not in school, but purely by accident. I couldn't believe that such an important incident in our nation's history that occurred in my proverbial backyard remained unknown to me for so long. In the last paragraph of A Massacre in Memphis, Professor Ash issued both an indictment and a challenge to Memphis. He pointed out that we had, and I'm quoting, no memorial marking the events of May 1st through 3rd of 1866. And he suggested that perhaps the sesquicentennial will provide an opportunity to rectify this lapse of memory. Well, I decided that I would not only do my part to make sure that we had a historical marker to remember the victims of the 1866 Memphis Massacre, but I would also do my part to make sure that we would never forget. Next slide, please. That resolve kept being tested during the more than 9 months that I worked on the historical marker project. First, I had to decide to which historical commission should I send the application, the Shelby County Historical Commission or the Tennessee Historical Commission. Ultimately, I decided that what happened in Memphis was so impactful that it deserved to be acknowledged by our entire state. So I submitted the application to the State Historical Commission. I drafted the application, carefully citing the source for each alleged fact, and waited impatiently to hear from the Tennessee Historical Commission. In September of 2015, a member of the state's Historical Commission presented a redraft of the proposed text for the historical marker to the executive director of the Memphis NAACP. The redraft revealed the following surprising points of concern for that member of the State Historical Commission. If you could go to, I believe it's the next slide, please. Yes, okay. So this is the redraft that was presented to us. And if you'll notice, essentially there was strenuous objection to calling the massacre a massacre. Instead, they wanted to entitle it Memphis Race Riot of 1866. It appeared to be very important to create the impression that ex-Confederates were not involved in the massacre. There's the second sentence you'll notice says the riot was an explosion of rage and violence perpetrated not by ex-Confederates, but by up to 300 Irish immigrants, including many who were policemen against recently emancipated Blacks. So it's very important to the person redrafting the text for us, this member of the State Historical Commission, that we put in there that the riot was not committed by ex-Confederates. Okay. For some reason, it appeared to be important to specify that the white mob that attacked the Black people were Irish recent immigrants, not old citizens. And there was somewhat, and this appeared more so as we got into negotiations with the State Historical Commission, there appeared to be some reluctance to specify that the mob was led by law enforcement. The picture got a little bit cloudy on my screen, so I don't know if you can see it, but they were willing to admit that law enforcement might be involved, but there was a lot of hesitancy to tell the truth, in which is that this massacre was led by law enforcement. There also appeared to be an attempt to insinuate that the Union military leadership in Memphis should shoulder much of the blame. And there appeared to be reluctance to acknowledge the impact that the massacre had on Congress while it was debating the hotly contested text of the proposed 14th Amendment. So let's start with the first, if you'll go back to the previous slide, please, Jessica. Yes, okay. Let's start with talking about the title of the historical marker, Massacre versus Riot. It actually was because of the objection to the title that I came to fully appreciate the importance of telling the story correctly. It was only after that objection that I started thinking more deeply about the project. I read the text more carefully and was shocked to realize that despite getting the title right in my proposal to the Historical Commission, in the actual text of the marker, I'd referred to the massacre as a riot. So I'd entitled it 1866 Memphis Massacre, but there was one point in my original submission where I referred to it as a riot. And I felt like thereby I was really merely parroting what the pro-Confederate newspapers had called it back in 1866. So after I began to read the transcripts of the testimony of recently freed men and women, some who were just 1 year out of slavery, I better understood the incredible courage that they must have had to give testimony against the white culprits who still lived in the area. They had the courage to actually name names back in 1866. And so reading their testimony made me resolved. I realized that it was not sufficient to remind people that the Memphis Massacre had occurred. It was important that I tell their stories right. I must tell the victim stories correctly. Their voices have been distorted and then silenced for 149 years. If we told their stories wrong in 2016, it would be like victimizing them again. And so the pressure that I felt to do the right thing was enormous. I felt also that many members of the state's historical commission were uncomfortable with my contradiction of the false or distorted narratives that were concocted for the purpose of avoiding accountability during the time that the massacre occurred. This discomfort appeared to me to be an implicit resistance to the idea that Memphians of color could be legitimate orators of our own historical experiences. One of my challenges to the Tennessee Historical Commission's decision resulted in them re-examining some of the language that they had approved in their text. So the initial hearing before the Historical Commission was done in October of 2015. They rejected the NAACP's version of the text, and instead they accepted the revised text or a version of the revised text of the member of the Historical Marker Committee for the commission who had lodged an objection. Need to understand that before we went to a meeting of the full commission, we had a meeting of the Historical Marker Committee, and that committee voted to approve the NAACP's text. There was one person who attended that meeting who objected to the text, and he was a long-term member of the State Historical Commission, and he was from Memphis, and he took his objection to the full Historical Commission. And at the meeting where they were to approve text, they chose to approve his version of the text instead of the NAACP's version. So in support now of the NAACP's text, I submitted a letter of support from two noted historians, and one was Black and female professor, Professor Beverly Bond, and the other was white male professor, Professor Stephen Ash. And it seemed to me that the representative of the Tennessee Historical Commission who reached out to me to try to broker a compromise after that October 2015 meeting seemed like he went out of his way to make it crystal clear that the commission was willing to take the unusual step of reconsidering their previously adopted text only because of the support of the white male professor. So again, that fed into the idea that there seemed to be a belief that Memphians of color or people of color could not be trusted to be orators of our own stories. Culpability was an issue. There was real discomfort with acknowledging the racial identity of the attackers, as well as the law enforcement and firefighter vocations of many of the leaders of the massacre. It seemed to me that the commission was trying to suggest that Irish people were not considered white, or they did not have the privilege of being white in 1866. They insinuated that the impoverished Irish community acted alone without encouragement from Southern whites. And that particular fact that they really pressed hard, it did not appear to be true, as evidenced by the fact that I was able to find several named culprits of Irish descent, people who people had named as some of the culprits before the select committee. I found them listed as veterans of the Confederate Army. So the commission's attempt to say that this was done solely by the Irish people who were the predominant members of the police at the time did not seem to ring true with the idea that if they were Irish, they were not old citizens. They were not Confederates, and the Confederates were not, the ex-Confederates were not involved in this, because we found that many of the people named were actually listed as veterans of the Confederate Army. And this is probably most surprising to me, there seemed to be resistance to acknowledging the effect that the massacre had on finally convincing Congress to adopt the language of the 14th Amendment so that it could be sent to the individual states for a ratification vote. An interesting subtext of this reluctance is that there seemed to be more of a desire amongst some members of the Tennessee Historical Commission to accredit the New Orleans massacre as helping speed congressional approval of the 14th Amendment than the Memphis massacre. That was it was really perplexing to me, because the massacre in New Orleans occurred on July 30th, 1866, which was 2 months after Congress had already adopted the language of the 14th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification, while the Memphis massacre occurred shortly before the congressional vote to adopt the language. The massacre was reportedly referenced by Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania in a floor debate on the 14th Amendment, where he said, "Let not the," and I'm quoting, "let not these friends of succession sing to me their siren song of peace and goodwill until they can stop my ears to the screams and the groans of the dying victims at Memphis." So it's clear that what happened at Memphis, Congress was definitely aware of it. They sent a select committee to investigate it, and a reference to the Memphis massacre made it onto the floor of the House during debate over the 14th Amendment. Yet I found a lot of resistance amongst the members of the State Historical Commission to giving the victims of the massacre any credit for convincing Congress to finally agree to the text of the 14th Amendment. So I think we need to ask ourselves why the important role that Memphis has played in the development of our democracy, which the 14th Amendment is a critical part of the development of our democracy. Why does it remain consciously unacknowledged? Why are our contributions so overlooked? To me, that's an interesting question for some academician to explore in the future. In the end, multiple versions of the historical marker text were considered, including 2 different versions that were adopted over the Memphis NAACP's objections. The Tennessee Historical Commission took the unusual position of reconsidering the first text, as I mentioned before, that it had adopted after the Memphis NAACP lodged a formal objection to the Historical Commission's suggestion that it would find another sponsor to pay to erect a historical marker using its text, and it would place that historical marker on the site that we had reserved for our historical marker. So that was particularly upsetting to the Memphis NAACP. We submitted an application with our text that was fully documented, and cited to primary sources. And instead of accepting our text, they decided to present their own text. And when we said we don't accept that and we will not pay for the marker, they said, we'll find another sponsor. And we said, well, where are you going to put the marker? We're going to put it at the same place that you have reserved for your marker. And so again, it seemed to be part of that same theme that people of color or agencies of color, like the Memphis NAACP, were not considered to be valid orators of our own history. If we could move 2 slides down, please. Yes, positive outcomes. So it's not all negative. The controversies surrounding the text of the historical marker created significant attention that had the effect of actually bringing our community together. A diverse group of people became interested in the historical marker, and Professor Bond, Professor Susan O'Donovan, and Professor Andre Johnson, all of the University of Memphis, collaborated to pull together a loose coalition of groups to promote awareness of this important historical event. And let me say the National Park Service was a very important, played a very important role in getting the academicians at the University of Memphis together with those of us at the Memphis NAACP and many other groups involved in commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Memphis Massacre. We had Lemoyne College held an event commemorating the victims of the massacre in February of 2016. And thereafter, Rhodes College hosted a well-attended lecture featuring Professor Ash as the speaker. And I worked with the Memphis NAACP on the dedication ceremony for the historical marker that was held on May 2nd, 2016. The National Park Service commissioned a song that was sung by songwriter and recording artist Antonio Neal Phelan during the dedication ceremony for the historical marker at the National Civil Rights Museum. The Memphis NAACP also sponsored an art and literary contest about the 1866 Memphis Massacre for 8th through 12th grade students in Shelby County. And the grand prize winners of each category, art, poetry, and essay, the grand prize winners of each category won $500 each. And I worked with the Memphis Bar Association to present a luncheon on May 3rd, 2016 in the Peabody Hotel's largest ballroom. Attorney Brian Stevenson of Just Mercy fame and of Equal Justice Initiative fame was our keynote speaker at the luncheon. And I took a lot of pleasure in the fact that the proceeds from the luncheon were dedicated to supporting the Memphis Bar Association SLIP program, which stands for Summer Law Internship Program. It's a summer law internship program for minority high school students in Shelby County. And I thought that the victims of the massacre would have been pleased that people are honoring their memory by supporting educational advancement of children whose educational advancement would have solicited violence in their time. We also presented a seminar at the National Civil Rights Museum where lawyers and the public assembled to learn more about the 1866 Memphis Massacre and its impact on the 14th Amendment. Professors Beverly Bond, Susan O'Donovan, and Andre Johnson, they put together a 2-day symposium later that hosted preeminent historians nationwide for a discussion about the 1866 Memphis Massacre. So ultimately, although it wasn't easy, I think we accomplished our goal. More people are aware of the tragic events in Memphis in 1866 and how the plight of the victims quite possibly changed the trajectory of our nation. Next slide, please. That is part of the program for the dedication service that was held on May 1st, 2016 at the National Civil Rights Museum. Next slide, please. And that is a photograph of the 1866 Memphis Massacre. It was erected with the sponsorship of the National Park Service. And I want to thank Tim Good, who at the time was the superintendent of the National Park Service of the Ulysses S. Grant site in St. Louis, Missouri, and his help and support of really all of the projects that Memphis held back in 2016 on the 150th anniversary. Was his support was just invaluable. So that is the text, and you will notice that the title is 1866 Memphis Massacre. And I will let you all read the sign at your leisure, or better yet, go by the corner of Second Street and G.E. Patterson. And there's a tiny park, Army Park on one side, Navy Park on the other side. And in Army Park, you'll find this sign. So I encourage you to go and look at the sign in person. Another anniversary is coming up, May 1st of this year. And that would be a great opportunity for people to go and pay their respects to what the victims suffered of the massacre, and to what was accomplished to benefit our nation as a result of the outrage for what happened to the victims of the massacre. Next slide, please. Go ahead and play the video, please.
If these streets could talk, they would tell you about people who were proud to know that they were free. If these streets could talk, they would tell you about evil that stained his face with the blood of moms and dads and the children that didn't have the chance to make it home. Memphis, we remember. We remember you. We remember, and we'll never forget. If these streets could talk, they would tell you about people who had every right to run and hide. And if these streets could talk, they would tell you about people who stood up for truth and what was right. For the moms and dads and the children that didn't have the chance to make it home. Memphis, we remember you. Ooh, we remember you. And we remember, and we'll never forget. Memphis, we remember. Oh my, we remember. Oh, you, yes we do. We remember, and we'll never forget how long until we. Oh my, how long until we are free. How long until we are free? Oh, in Memphis we remember. Oh yeah, we remember you, and we remember, and we'll never forget. Oh, and we'll never forget. And we'll never forget.
May we never forget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney Aluko. Oh, good. I have a couple of questions, but let me see if there's anything in the Q&A box. All right. Nothing yet, but thank you so much for sharing that. You know, we drive around and we see the markers, and many of us, we don't know the hard work that goes into getting those things erected, rather. And I think it's very, very important for people to know that that is actually within their power, our power, to recognize history. One question I had was, you know, there was a lot of back and forth between you and the Historical Commission and the NAACP and the Historical Commission. In the interest of transparency in these processes and to inspire others who would like to know how this process is done, how much of that, of those back and forths, is that like recorded in some way for people to look up and see how it was done?
Yes, well, the meetings of the State Historical Commission are public meetings. And so they are recorded. In fact, I have the recordings of the two meetings I went to. The first one in October 2015 was in Jonesboro. That was another growth opportunity for me because I had actually never been to East Tennessee before. Been out of the country, you know, I studied in another state. So I lived in another state for about 7 years while I was completing my education, but I had never been to East Tennessee, and it's beautiful country. But that was my first opportunity to do that. And then something unusual occurred at the meeting. The members of Nathan Bedford Forrest's descendants were invited to come to the meeting and to speak. And as they were denying the NAACP's request and adopting the person who invited the members of the descendants of Nathan Bedford Forrest to the meeting, and they gave them applause for being descendants of Nathan Bedford Forrest at the same time that they were denying our request for our historical marker. So I thought it was important for me to get a recording of that, because people would never believe that actually happened. And I also have a recording of the second meeting I went to. That was in Nashville, so it's a lot closer. Yes, the short answer is yes, you can get the recordings of the proceedings. Now, whether or not they will make available the actual written documents, the application, I would assume that would be public record as well. But certainly the meetings themselves are public.
Let me check the Q&A box. There's a Pan Awesome said, amazing, credible, moving presentation. Thank you very much, Phyllis. Glenn Keese, in response to my question, yes, would love to see who voted and how they voted. Do they keep a record of the votes somewhere?
Well, the proceedings are
they're recorded.
They are recorded. So ultimately there is a record. Whether or not they post the votes the way maybe the legislature might do, so that you don't have to listen to the recording to know who voted, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Were there any, you said that the massacre happened after there was a group of Black soldiers who were, I think that's called mustered out.
Yes.
Were there any veterans who were killed in this?
Oh, absolutely. They were especially targeted. The presence of African-American soldiers in the community was particularly antagonizing to some members of the Memphis community. And so they were targets, and the families and their families were also targets.
Has the Army or any armed forces noted or commemorated the deaths of these veterans before? Or,
I can't answer that, but I can say that during this, during the whole project of trying to get the historical marker, Tim Good of the National Park Service did say that our historical marker would be the first such, acknowledgement or honoring or marker, commemorating is probably the better word, will be the first marker commemorating a Reconstruction era event. So it's my understanding that according to the National Park Service, that ours will be the first. So that would lead me to believe that the Armed Forces probably has not commemorated this event, although they did investigate it at the time. There were this event went viral in the truest sense of how the word is used today. People across the country learned about the Memphis Massacre because it played into the whole debate between President Johnson, another Tennessean, who was not in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that had just been passed in April, and was certainly not in favor of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. He didn't think he needed it. He felt like the South could handle things on their own without being told, who had certain rights and who didn't have certain rights. And so, when he was leading the effort to frankly let the South figure it out on their own, and then you had the other side who felt like we can't trust them. We've got to provide some national guidance for their behavior, especially before they come back into the Union as voting members. And so that debate kept waging on, and that's why the 14th Amendment was held up in committee because of that debate. And then the Memphis Massacre occurred, May 1st through 3rd. And that convinced enough people that you needed stricter Reconstruction laws. You could not depend upon the South to self-govern itself.
Right, thanks for that. You have to forgive me, I have a little visitor here who insists that the nursery rhymes stay at a certain volume, so I've been trying to minimize that. I have one more question for you. You said that your e-reader was recommending this book to you,
Mhm.
and you ignored it for a while before finding indulging. So what was on your reading list? What were you reading at the time?
There were actual, I didn't have a lot of time for reading, but when I did take time to read something for myself and not for my work, it was usually historical, books. And so it kept coming up, but the title was a Memphis Massacre. And I just never stopped to read the description of the book until I had gotten through everything else that I had intentionally purchased and wanted to read. And then I finally read the description, and I was stunned. I had never heard of it. And I'm someone who I took AP history in high school here in Memphis. So how does one get out of AP American history in Memphis and not hear about the Memphis Massacre? So I was stunned. I keep saying stunned, but that's
Yes.
just the only, that just describes it. And for some reason, I felt like it was important for me to step up to the plate. And when Professor Ash wrote in the very last paragraph of his book, he wrote that both the challenge and the indictment of Memphis. At the same time, I felt a calling to respond. And I said, this is something I can do. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how you went about getting a historical marker, but I knew I could do research, and I knew I could put together an application. And let me also thank the Memphis NAACP, because when I presented it to them, they immediately signed on. And I still didn't know how it was going to get paid for. And I kind of assumed that I was probably going to end up paying for it myself. Hi there. And then out of the blue, I get a call from Tim Good of the National Park Service, who apparently has heard about the NAACP's efforts from Professor Ash, who I had reached out to for support. And the National Park Service was on board, and they were able to fund the project, and we were able to move forward. Now, there are many twists and turns and ups and downs in the process that I did not allude to in the presentation. But finally, everything came together. Everything probably came together the last part of April. And we knew that because there was a little bit of a skirmish over whether or not we would still be allowed to put the marker up if it was not a Tennessee Historical Commission marker. There was a change in leadership of the mayor, between the mayor whose administration gave us approval to put the marker in Army Park. There was a change in leadership, and so we had to see if the new mayor would agree. And there was a time when we waited right up until the last minute. So the marker was actually ordered on faith. The marker with the text that the NAACP and its advisors approved was ordered on faith, because when we ordered it, we did not know that the prior promise to let us put the marker up in Army Park was going to be honored. And the marker came in, and I think the marker was here when we finally got the word that the mayor's administration would allow us to indeed erect the marker. And then the mayor came to the dedication service, and many other dignitaries came to the dedication service. And it was just, it was a wonderful event. And the song, the video that you all heard, We Remember by Antonio Phelan, he sung that live during the service, and we had additional music, and it was a wonderful coming together of community. And let me also say, the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis was supportive. That's when I first met Randall and Sharon of the Lynching Sites Project, and they reached out to the NAACP and wanted to know how can we help.
Yeah. So we actually had a couple of questions come in. Rahab Mitchell had a question, but you actually answered it, as you just spoke. Sammy McDaniel asked, have you ever studied the Fort Pillow Massacre 2 years earlier?
Now that I had heard of, that did make it into the history books. But the Memphis Massacre, I just, maybe I was asleep in history class that day, but I suspect that I'm not alone in being a lifelong Memphian who had not heard of it. And especially the connection to the 14th Amendment, which is just so critical to our understanding of what it means to be American. I mean, that is the amendment that says because you were born here, you're actually a citizen. And so you think about it, if that debate had gone the other way, and keep in mind, the president was against the 14th Amendment at the time. Andrew Johnson didn't think it was necessary. So if the debate had gone the other way, would we have citizenship by birth here, in the United States? So it's just so critical to not only Memphis, not only our state, but to our nation and our concept of democracy, that I just could not believe that Memphians would not know about it.
Thank you. We have no more questions in the Q&A. I want to ask you a final question, but similar to you, Phyllis, I had spent my high school years here in Memphis. I took AP American History right over here at Central High School and did not learn that as well. And it's, don't know if you're familiar, but the LSP, we have a podcast called The Red Record, and I'm about to be Wells, that you can find on Spotify or Apple Music, or Apple Podcasts rather. And we ask our guests a question. We ask them all this question. And it's quite telling that you didn't learn about it in school, and me as well. It's not really focused. But the question I have for you is, when did you first learn about lynching?
Oh, well, now I had known about lynching probably all of my life. Keep in mind, I was raised by my mom, who's from DeSoto County, Mississippi. And so as her only child, I learned early on as to some of the experiences that people in her community had. So I always knew about lynching. Did not know about the L. Persons lynching. And that's something I had to learn after, I became an adult, and I worked with the Lynching Sites Project on their L. Persons marker. We collaborated on that because it was that lynching that prompted Memphis to establish a branch of the NAACP. So that was kind of a collaborative project started by Lynching Sites Project, and they invited the Memphis NAACP to join in on that. So I hadn't heard about that specific lynching, but of course, Emmett Till, lynching was a part of my consciousness from a child.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for your time and your presentation. I would like to say that Tim Good actually is listed as one of the attendees. So he heard you give high praise just now. Okay. Someone's just, Elizabeth Walker is wondering if we could just post a link to the podcast in the Q&A. I just kind of know if you can do it fairly quickly or not. But one thing that we can do in our newsletters, we can include a link to the podcast so that all of our subscribers to the newsletters will have it. You can get it on Spotify, Apple Music, I believe Google as well, Anchor, wherever you get your podcasts, as they say. This first season wrapped up in January, where we talked about the 1851 lynching of the anonymous man. And We had 5 episodes this past first season, and look for more later on this year. So again, Phyllis, let's just see if Jessica has been able to know. Not yet. It may take a while to find that link.
That link should be, I think it might have just gone to Gail. I'll post it for everyone too. When I posted, I think it just went to, so let me go ahead and I'm going to post it as a question.
Okay. And in addition to that, in our next newsletter, we should post a link or links to the podcast for folks to click on.
It is not letting me put a question in. You go to our website, lynchingsitesmen.org. There is a link at the very top of the page.
Okay. Please give it a listen, give us a good review, and look for us next month. We'll have another exciting speaker talking about the legacy of Ida B. Wells. Thank you again, Attorney Aluko, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.